The forest doesn't always give answers. Sometimes it only takes. National parks are supposed to be places where we feel alive, where families gather around waterfalls, where hikers chase sunsets, where trails promise peace. But they're also places where people vanish, not miles off the trail, not after weeks in the wilderness, sometimes in the space of just 10 feet. In June of 2019, 3 friends were hiking in Washington's North Cascades. The weather was perfect, the trail well-marked and steady, the kind of day where everything feels predictable. They were close enough to hear each other's voices, laughing, calling out, trading words over the sound of boots on dirt. And yet, in the time it took to round a single bend, one of them was gone. Forever. This is what has come to be known as a missing 411 case, a term coined by investigator David Paulides. He began documenting strange vanishings in America's parks and forests, cases that didn't follow the normal rules of people getting lost. The more stories he gathered, the stranger the patterns became. There were clusters of disappearances in the same mountain ranges, sudden storms that struck the moment someone went missing, children found miles away in terrain they couldn't possibly have crossed, dogs that refused to track as if a scent trail had simply evaporated. Among all of these, one kind of case stands apart. The kind where someone disappears in an impossibly small window of space and time. Not hundreds of yards. Not even dozens of feet. Sometimes it's the gap created when a hiker stops to tie their bootlace. Sometimes it's the few steps of distance when a parent looks back at their child. Sometimes it's no more than 10 feet, a distance so small that logic insists nothing could happen. And yet, again and again, people are simply gone. Search and rescue professionals talk about these disappearances as the ones that haunt them. Because the math doesn't work. People don't just vanish while still within earshot, within arm's reach, within sight. And yet they do. Tonight we're stepping into one of the most chilling examples of this pattern. A young woman, experienced, prepared, and cautious, vanished in broad daylight, while her friends were just a few steps behind her. They saw her seconds before, they heard her voice. And then she was gone, as if the forest had swallowed her whole. Because in these mountains, the space between safety and disappearance isn't measured in miles. Sometimes, it's just 10 feet. Sarah Chen was the kind of hiker who made everyone around her feel at ease on the trail. 28 years old, steady on her feet, and the unofficial trip planner among her friends. She'd been hiking since her teens, logging trips up and down the Pacific Northwest, and she had a reputation for knowing where to go, what to pack, and how to keep a group moving. In photos she posted online, she always seemed to be squinting at maps, grinning under a baseball cap, a thermos of coffee tucked in one hand. This wasn't just any hike for her. She wanted to show off one of her favorite trails in the North Cascades, a stretch of switchbacks that curled into thick forest before opening to mountain views. It wasn't technical, but it was long enough to feel rewarding. It was the kind of place she knew like the back of her hand. She brought 2 people with her that June morning. Marcus Williams, 30 years old, her boyfriend of 2 years. He wasn't a hardcore outdoorsman, but he loved tagging along, especially because it meant watching Sarah in her element. He was a graphic designer who spent most days in front of a computer, so these trips felt like another world. He liked to tease her about how seriously she took trail snacks. Always granola measured into little bags. Always an apple or 2. And she'd tease him back for showing up in sneakers that were better suited for sidewalks than mountains. Then there was David Torres, 29, Sarah's childhood friend visiting from Oregon. He hadn't been to the North Cascades before, and Sarah wanted to give him something unforgettable. David worked in tech support, the kind of guy who spent his weekdays solving other people's problems. Patient but drained. For him, this trip was a break, a reunion, and maybe a chance to finally understand why Sarah was always pushing her friends to just get outside. The morning was perfect, the kind of day hikers dream about. Sky, a clean blue, sun filtering through the trees without burning, the ground still damp from a rain 2 nights before. The air carried the sharp smell of pine and earth, a freshness city air never quite has. Birds darted from branch to branch, and far off, they could hear water running through gullies below. They set off single file, but always within earshot. Sarah in front, with her blue pack shifting as she walked, Marcus in the middle, steady and unhurried, occasionally pulling out his phone for photos. David trailed behind, pausing here and there to point out wildflowers he hadn't seen before, or just to catch his breath on steeper sections. It was ordinary. Comfortable. The kind of hike where conversation drifts, where laughter echoes through the trees, and everyone forgets how far they've gone. They made good time until mile 3.5, where the trail narrowed into a long switchback hugging the slope. Ferns brushed against their legs, and dense vegetation walled them in. The path curved sharply, meaning you could hear someone just ahead, even if you couldn't see them. Marcus remembered talking as they approached. He tossed a comment forward, something about the view, and Sarah laughed. He turned slightly, passing another remark back to David. He could hear his friend's response behind him, breath catching a little on the incline. Voices carried easily. They were all together, just a few steps apart. Then Sarah rounded the bend. Marcus followed maybe 15 seconds later. When he did, the trail ahead was empty. At first it didn't register as strange. She was probably a few yards farther up. He called her name once, casually. The sound bounced against the trees and faded. No answer. He walked a little faster, expecting to see her pack just ahead. Nothing. He slowed, frowning, and called louder. Still nothing. David caught up behind him, puzzled. "Where's Sarah?" he asked, looking up the trail. Marcus gestured ahead. "She's right there. Just ahead. She can't be far." They both moved quickly now, jogging 20-30 yards. The trail curved again, but there was no flash of blue nylon, no movement, no sign of her. Just the narrow dirt track threading into trees. That was when a prickle of unease crept in. Marcus shouted, louder this time. His voice carried, but the forest didn't answer back. Not even an echo, only the soft rush of water far below, and the occasional creak of trees in the wind. The first thought was the obvious one. Maybe she'd stepped off the trail for a bathroom break. Hikers did that all the time. Maybe she'd scrambled a few feet up an embankment for a better view. Maybe she'd stopped, quietly waiting to jump out and startle them, something she'd done once before. So they waited. A minute. 2. They called her name, laughing nervously, half expecting her to pop out from the bushes. But no Sarah appeared. Panic builds slowly, in layers. At first it's just a flicker. She's not where she should be. Then it's a stubborn denial. She'll show up in a second. But after 10 minutes of calling, backtracking, scanning both sides of the trail, the flicker had turned into something heavier. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, pacing. David blew a whistle he carried, the sharp sound slicing through the silence. It echoed, and echoed, but no reply came. They began moving in frantic loops, forward and back, searching places she couldn't possibly have gone in such a short time. Everywhere they looked, the forest stood still, no bent branches, no footprints leading off, no sound of boots crunching in undergrowth. Just the emptiness pressing in, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat. Half an hour passed like that, searching, calling, listening, scanning the same stretch of trail again and again. Each minute that ticked by chipped away at their rational explanations. She wasn't just ahead. She wasn't just off trail for a moment. She wasn't anywhere they could reach. By the 1-hour mark, dread had settled in. Marcus's voice cracked as he called her name again. David's face was pale, his movements jerky, panicked. Both of them knew the truth no one wanted to say. Sarah hadn't just wandered. She was gone. Marcus pulled out his phone again. Signal was weak, but a call scraped through. His words tumbled out fast and shaky. "We were hiking. She was right here, 10 feet in front of me. And then she wasn't. She's gone." By the time rangers arrived, the shadows were lengthening across the trail. What had started as a simple hike between 3 friends had transformed into something else entirely. A mystery that would consume them, and everyone who tried to make sense of how someone could vanish in the space of a single breath. A single bend in the trail, a gap of only 10 feet. The call came in just after 2:30 p.m. Marcus's voice was shaking, clipped by static. He repeated the words twice before the ranger on duty believed him. She was right in front of me, 10 feet. Then she was gone. By 4 p.m., the first search and rescue team was on the trail. Search and rescue, or SAR, has a rhythm that's both efficient and unnerving. When someone goes missing in the backcountry, especially in a national park, the first responders know every second matters. People can survive 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, but the margin shrinks fast in mountain terrain, where exposure can kill overnight. Sarah had vanished in broad daylight. Weather was stable. Visibility was excellent. That should have been in her favor. And yet the very clarity of the conditions made her disappearance harder to explain. The first ranger on scene took Marcus and David aside. They were both pale, jittery, still scanning the tree line as if Sarah might suddenly emerge. Marcus described the trail bend, the conversation, the exact moment he realized she wasn't answering. David confirmed every detail. Their stories matched perfectly. By protocol, rangers marked the last known point, an imaginary line across the dirt where Sarah's presence ended. They called it the LKP. Everything radiates outward from that line. Dogs were brought in within the hour. Search dogs, unlike humans, don't rely on sight or sound. They work a world of invisible threads. Skin cells, sweat particles, molecules left hanging in the air or pressed into soil. Each person is a trail of scent drifting behind them like smoke. Sarah's pack, retrieved from her car, was presented for a scent article. The dog, an experienced German shepherd trained in wilderness tracking, sniffed, ears pricking forward. Then it set off, handler in tow, straight down the trail toward the bend. At first it looked promising. The dog's tail wagged, nose low, pulling with confidence. Marcus and David felt a flicker of relief. At least the animal could pick up what they couldn't. At least someone, something, could follow her path. Then, at the exact curve where Marcus said he'd last heard her voice, the dog stopped. It circled once. Twice. Its ears went flat. It barked sharply, then whined. The handler frowned, kneeling to encourage it. The dog sniffed again, paced a tight circle, then sat down abruptly, its head lowered, tail still. Refusal. The handler exchanged a look with the ranger. She was here, then nothing. Another dog was brought in. Same process, same result. The scent trail was strong up to the bend, then evaporated. For handlers, this kind of behavior is chilling. It suggests not that the person walked away undetected, but that their scent was somehow cut, as if they'd been lifted out of the environment. SAR professionals don't phrase it that way, of course. They'll say discontinuity of trail. But to Marcus and David standing a few feet away, the meaning was the same. Sarah had been erased from that spot. Night was closing in. Protocol dictated the first operational period. Grid search teams deployed within a 1-mile radius of the LKP. Volunteers, both trained SAR members and local community responders, were divided into line searches, combing the forest in parallel sweeps. Each person was spaced arm's length apart, moving in coordinated patterns, eyes scanning ground and branches for any trace. A footprint, a scrap of clothing, a broken branch. The terrain worked against them. The North Cascades canopy is dense, massive evergreens blotting out sky, their roots clutching steep slopes. Understory ferns and brush tangled every step. A person could step 3 yards off trail and vanish behind foliage. But in this case, Sarah hadn't stepped 3 yards off trail. She'd been 10 feet ahead, on open dirt, one moment visible, the next gone. Helicopters joined the search at dawn. Equipped with FLIR forward-looking infrared, they scanned ridgelines and hollows, hoping for the glow of body heat among the shadows. But FLIR has a weakness. Thick canopy blocks signatures, If Sarah was beneath those layers of branches, she'd be invisible from above. Still, crews flew grid patterns for hours. Nothing. On the ground, the search expanded. By day 2, more than 40 people were working the area. By day 3, over 100. By the end of the first week, nearly 300 volunteers, rangers, and even specialized military-trained Green Berets were combing the slopes. Maps pinned to the command tent showed overlapping grids, each square marked off with colored tape to indicate where teams had passed. The LKP glowed like a bullseye at the center, circles radiating outward. The strange part was not the size of the search, but its emptiness. No prints, no torn clothing, no candy wrappers, no broken twigs. Nothing to suggest Sarah had walked anywhere at all. The most unsettling piece of evidence came from Sarah's own phone, recovered later from data backups. Her last photo was timestamped 2:17 p.m., just minutes before Marcus lost sight of her. It was a selfie, the kind hikers take mid-trail. Flushed cheeks, sunlight dappled across her face, forest blurred behind her. She looked relaxed, smiling, sweaty, but content. The metadata confirmed her GPS location, right there on the switchback. But after that photo, her phone went silent. No further pings, no background app signals, nothing. It was as if the device itself had dropped off the map along with her. Search coordinators brought in trackers, experts who could read the faintest impressions in soil. They examined the bend inch by inch. Their conclusion: the trail bore the prints of Marcus and David, clear and continuous. Sarah's tracks appeared leading into the bend, but not out. This baffled even veteran SAR members. You expect to see compression in the soil, a rolling pattern where boots lift leaves. Here it's like her trail just ends. Marcus replayed the moment again and again. He swore he'd heard her voice seconds before. He could still picture the sway of her blue pack as she rounded the curve. He'd expected to see her standing 10 yards ahead. Instead, there had been only silence. And the silence itself became a character in the search. SAR teams reported how still the forest felt, how even birdsong seemed muted near the LKP. Normally the Cascades ring with the calls of thrushes, woodpeckers, jays. But in that sector, people whispered of an acoustic shadow, a quiet so thick it pressed against their ears. Sound technicians later analyzed the area, finding no anomalies. Yet searchers swore something about that hollow didn't behave like the rest of the woods. Other strange details surfaced. One handler noted that his dog, after circling fruitlessly, pulled back with tail tucked, a sign of stress, not confusion. Another pointed out the odd lack of animal activity in the immediate grid. No deer scat, no small mammal prints, as if wildlife themselves avoided the spot. Veterans compared it to other cases. Dogs losing scent abruptly is not unheard of in SAR. But usually it's explainable. Washed out by rain, disrupted by water crossings, muddled in rocky terrain. Here the trail ended on dry dirt, in good weather, with no logical barrier. It shouldn't happen, one handler said flatly. But it did. Marcus and David were interviewed repeatedly. Investigators asked the same questions, testing for cracks. Did Sarah mention wanting to leave? Did anyone argue? Could she have staged this? Both men denied it firmly. Sarah had been in good spirits. Her life gave no hint of wanting to disappear. By day 4, fatigue was setting in. Volunteers stumbled back to base camp mud-caked, faces grey with worry. Helicopters reported only heat signatures of wildlife. Every lead dried out. And still, the maps grew. Search radii expanded mile by mile. Red string-marked ridgelines scoured. Pins noted false leads. Possible clothing. Discarded shirt, not victims. Campfire remnants. Unrelated. Marcus walked those maps each evening, staring at the concentric circles radiating from that one bend. He kept pointing at it as if to say, this is where she was. She didn't go anywhere else. She was right here. On day 6, the search officially transitioned from rescue to recovery. The unspoken acknowledgement that survival past that point was unlikely. Families often fight this reclassification, but Marcus didn't argue. His face had hardened into something quieter, something resigned. Yet the strangeness lingered. Rangers privately admitted the case unnerved them, not because people don't get lost, people do all the time, but because people don't get lost like this, not within sight of companions, not in conditions this clear, not with dogs and trackers all pointing to a trail that simply stopped. The official report summarized it clinically. Subject last seen on trail at approximately 14:20 hours. Extensive search yielded no further evidence. Case unresolved. Unofficially, among the SAR workers around campfires at night, the phrase came up again and again. The 10-foot gap. The impossible space where someone could vanish between one step and the next. And for Marcus, standing in the fading light at the bend, the words replayed endlessly in his head. He had been 10 feet away. He had heard her laugh seconds before, and then the forest swallowed her whole. The trail where Sarah vanished wasn't unique. That was perhaps the most disturbing realization as the search wound down. Her case joined a ledger of others spread across the American wilderness, each carrying the same maddening elements: proximity, clarity, and a gap so small it mocked explanation. To understand the pattern, you don't have to go back decades, though plenty of vanishings lurk in the archives. You only need to listen to the cases that rescuers still whisper about. One of the most infamous unfolded in Yellowstone 2016. The boy's name was Ethan. He was only 8 years old, dressed in a bright red jacket that made him stand out against the forest, like a cardinal against snow. His family had driven out for a summer trip, eager to show him the steaming geysers and wide meadows of the park. That morning they'd set out on a short hike, well-traveled, sunny, with dozens of other visitors. They walked in single file, the father in front, the mother in the middle with Ethan's younger sister, and Ethan at the back, dragging a stick along the dirt like children often do. At one point, the father called out for him to keep up. He turned, saw the boy trudging behind, head down, stick carving lazy grooves in the trail. Just 30 seconds later, when the mother glanced back, the space was empty. At first, they thought he'd simply paused to look at something. His red jacket should have been visible through the trees, even if he'd stepped slightly off the trail. But when they walked back, calling his name, there was no flash of color, no sound of leaves disturbed. Other hikers joined in. Within an hour, rangers had been called. That night, the search began in earnest. More than 100 people combed the area, shouting, clapping, trying to flush the boy out. Helicopters hovered overhead, spotlights cutting the darkness. His red jacket should have shone like a beacon. Instead, the beams returned nothing but black shadows and indifferent trees. When his body was finally found 3 days later, it was in a place that should have been impossible, nearly 2 miles away, across rough terrain and steep incline, deep in an area searchers had already passed. There were no clear injuries, no predation marks. The medical examiner listed exposure, but quietly admitted the timeline didn't line up. By all accounts, he should not have survived long enough to get that far, nor should he have been missed by the teams who swept the area multiple times. The family never accepted the official narrative. For them, the nightmare was simple. Their child had been within sight, wearing the brightest jacket possible, and somehow, he had been erased. Rangers who worked the case described it as the cruelest paradox. The easier it should have been to find him, the less trace he left. From Yellowstone's meadows we moved north, into Minnesota's Superior National Forest, 2017. Two friends, both in their early 40s, had grown up fishing together. They'd spent countless summers casting lines in small streams, sharing stories, enjoying the silence. This trip was supposed to be no different. That morning they hiked to a bend where a stream split into twin channels. One man took the left bank, the other, the right. They were close enough to talk, close enough to hear each other's reels whir. close enough that each could see the flash of sunlight on the other's rod. 20 feet separated them. Around mid-morning, one bent down to check his tackle box. He swore later that it was no more than 10 seconds, 15 at the most. When he looked up, the opposite bank was empty. His friend's rod leaned against a rock. The water rippled with the cast line drifting aimlessly. But the man himself was gone. He shouted, at first thinking his friend had stepped back into the trees for some reason. The woods answered with silence. He ran across the shallow water, checked the underbrush. Nothing. The man had disappeared within a space so small, under conditions so ordinary, that rescuers later described it as one of the most disorienting cases they'd ever worked. SAR dogs traced his scent along the bank, circling near where the rod had been left, then stopped. Helicopters scanned for miles, finding no sign. His family, devastated, could not accept that a man could vanish in daylight, in view of his best friend, on a stream they'd fished a dozen times. To this day, his body has never been recovered. The case lives in SAR briefings as a textbook example of what they call proximity vanishings, disappearances within direct line of sight. Then there was the couple in the Smokies, 2021. They were in their 50s, seasoned hikers who had spent years exploring trails together. That morning the weather was clear, the trail moderately trafficked. At some point the wife paused to tie her bootlace, telling her husband to walk ahead a few steps. He obliged, strolling maybe 10 yards forward, expecting her to catch up. When she looked up, he was gone. The section of trail stretched straight for nearly 50 feet. Visibility was excellent. There were no sharp turns, no cliffs, no underbrush thick enough to hide an adult. She called his name, growing frantic, then ran forward. The path was empty. Other hikers coming the opposite direction confirmed they had not seen anyone matching his description pass them. For hours she searched, joined quickly by rangers. Days passed. Then weeks. The official search eventually ended, but she never gave up. 6 months later, his body was discovered by a hunter, 4 miles off trail, across terrain that SAR leaders described as nearly impassable. He had no injuries consistent with forcing his way through brambles or scaling ravines. His clothing was intact. The coroner listed cause of death as exposure, but admitted decomposition was inconsistent with the time elapsed. For the surviving spouse, the grief carried a surreal edge. She had watched him vanish from within arm's reach, then lived months with the unanswered question: how could a man walk 10 steps ahead and end up 4 miles away, as if the forest itself had carried him there? Cases like these repeat across maps of America's wilderness, each with its own haunting detail. Consider the Colorado wilderness. 2009. A teenager on a scout trip, lagging just a few yards behind his troop, vanished on a trail with visibility clear for hundreds of feet. His pack was later found neatly propped against a tree. His body was never recovered. Or Oregon, 2014. A solo hiker texted his family a selfie from a ridgeline, timestamped, geotagged, then was never heard from again. His phone went dark immediately after. Searchers found no trace, not even a dropped water bottle. It was as if the last message had been a farewell from another dimension. Each story adds weight to the pattern. Bright clothing, close proximity, line-of-sight vanishings, dogs circling in confusion, helicopters finding nothing under dense canopy, and always the same refrain: the distance between safety and disappearance is measured not in miles but in seconds. Rescuers speak of how these cases feel different. A veteran SAR coordinator once admitted off record: in most searches you know you're chasing a person. They leave sign, they make noise, you get a breadcrumb trail. But in these, it's like you're chasing absence, like whatever you're looking for doesn't want to be found. The term, missing 411 inches, was coined by investigator David Paulides, and while skeptics challenge his conclusions, even they admit the raw case files are baffling. The 10-foot gap is not a theory, it's a repeated fact, logged in reports, witnessed by families, confirmed by SAR professionals. In Yellowstone, a boy's bright jacket should have been his salvation. Instead, it became a cruel symbol of visibility without presence. In Superior, the fishing buddies proved that even constant line of sight is no guarantee. In the Smokies, a wife's grief taught the world that love and trust don't shield you from the inexplicable. And in dozens of other places, maps are dotted with disappearances that sound almost mythic, until you read the official reports. Taken together, the cases create a chilling realization. The wilderness holds not just beauty and danger, but something else, something that erases people from within arm's reach, leaving behind only questions and the echo of voices calling through trees that never answer. For Marcus and David, Sarah's disappearance was singular, personal, but for those who've studied these cases, it was part of a greater pattern. The 10-foot gap doesn't just belong to one hiker in the Cascades. It belongs to many. And it is still out there waiting. Search and rescue teams don't like mysteries. They prefer patterns. A lost hiker who left a trail. A boot print in the mud. A candy wrapper snagged on a branch. Those are the threads that pull people home. But the cases we've just heard don't offer threads. They unravel into nothing. And so the only thing left is theory. The first explanations are always the simplest. Human error. A wrong step. An abduction. Rangers who've worked these cases will tell you that 9 times out of 10, someone disappears because they misjudged their own limits. They wandered too far off trail, panicked, got disoriented. The terrain takes them, and weather finishes what fear began. That's where the official reports usually stop. In Sarah's case, the paperwork said, exposure. In Ethan's case, the boy in the red jacket, it said hypothermia. In the Smokies, the husband's death was chalked up to exhaustion, and the cruel patience of the elements. These are the explanations that fit inside the neat boxes of paperwork. And yet, the rescuers themselves often walk away unsettled, because accidents leave signs. Broken branches. Disturbed soil. A path of descent into ravines. Bodies usually turn up near water, because desperate people head downhill. And abductions. They leave noise, resistance, sometimes even a scuffle. None of that appeared in these cases. So what about predators? The national parks are not zoos. Bears roam freely. Mountain lions stalk the shadows. Even in places where sightings are rare, predators are always a possibility. But here's what SAR teams point out. Predators are messy. They leave fur, blood, drag marks. A cougar doesn't spirit someone away cleanly. A black bear doesn't make a person vanish without a sound. And in every one of these disappearances, searchers combed the area within hours. No fur. No tracks. Nothing. The weather often comes next on the list of suspects. In the Smokies especially, storms roll down the ridges with terrifying speed. Fog can swallow a valley in minutes, changing clear trails into labyrinths. But even when weather plays its tricks, the missing usually leave a trail of confusion behind them. You find discarded gear, frantic footprints, even desperate shelters scratched together from branches. Yet in Sarah's 10-foot gap, there was nothing. In Ethan's red jacket case, the skies were clear. Weather may kill, but it rarely erases. Some researchers point to what they call the silent abduction, a theory that humans are capable of vanishing without trace because another human intervenes in the narrowest of windows. A man in the woods, waiting. A quick grab, a chokehold, disappearance by force. And in urban settings that theory holds weight. But out here, in daylight, on trails populated with hikers with no witnesses, no sounds, rangers admit it feels less like theory and more like a stretch. To pull someone off a trail in seconds without leaving broken branches or noise, it would take precision few believe possible. And so the rational explanations begin to wear thin. That's where SAR veterans sometimes lower their voices. They'll tell you about the things that make them uneasy. About the dogs. Scent dogs are trained to follow a human trail with relentless focus. They can track through rain, across asphalt, even over streams. But in missing 411 cases, handlers report the same pattern. The dog follows scent until it reaches a specific spot. Then it circles, whines, refuses to go forward. Not because the scent fades gradually, as it does when a person travels farther than the nose can reach, but because the scent stops cold, as if the subject ceased to exist. One sandshandler quoted in a local paper admitted, "I've worked 30 years with dogs. These are the only cases where they act afraid. Thermal imaging brings no comfort either. Helicopters crisscross the canopy with FLIR cameras capable of detecting the body heat of a rabbit. But in case after case, the missing person leaves no trace in the critical first hours. It's as if they're not under the canopy at all." This is where speculation begins. And speculation, when it comes to missing 411, spreads fast. One camp suggests geographic anomalies, places where magnetic fields warp compasses, and perhaps even affect human navigation. Park maps do note magnetic irregularities in some wilderness regions. Could disorientation strike so suddenly, so powerfully, that a hiker steps only a few feet away and never returns? Perhaps. But again, where are the footprints? Others whisper about sinkholes, caves, or hidden fissures. The idea that a person could step wrong, vanish underground, and never be seen again. In karst terrain, that's plausible. Whole caverns exist beneath the Smokies. But what about cases like the Fishing Buddies, where the ground was solid and visible? Or Sarah, on a well-trodden switchback? And then, there are theories that cross into the uncanny. The notion of time slips, stories where people step into folds of reality, vanishing into another time or dimension. It sounds like science fiction, and most professionals scoff. Yet believers point to the eerie consistency, disappearances happening in moments, within sight, with no signs of struggle, as if someone was plucked out of one frame of existence and not returned. Still others argue unknown predators could be at work. Cryptid hunters talk of the silent ones, creatures that stalk but leave no trace, drag no bodies. Folklore is rich with stories of beings tied to the land. The Cherokee warned of Nunehi, spirit people of the mountains who could appear and vanish at will, luring travelers into other realms. Legends, yes. But when a ranger hears a child's voice crying through the holler for hours with no child found, the line between myth and evidence grows thin. And then there is the darkest theory of all, that the wilderness itself participates. That the land chooses. That in certain places the forest decides who stays and who leaves. Searchers joke grimly about it, but not always with laughter in their eyes. Because when you've seen footprints stop in the middle of snow with no exit, or heard a dog whine at empty air, you begin to wonder if the park is keeping its own secrets. But what do the numbers say? Here is where statistics add another layer of unease. In most missing person cases in the backcountry, resolution comes quickly. Studies show that nearly 80% of lost hikers are found within 24 hours. More than 90% are found within 48. And those found usually left trails, footprints, broken branches, dropped gear. Missing 411 cases defy that math. Dogs stop cold. Time gaps are measured in seconds, not hours. Bodies, if found, appear in terrain so rugged it defies explanation of how they arrived, and in a haunting number of instances, they're never recovered at all. Maps of national parks show clusters: the Sierra Nevada, the Cascades, the Great Smokies, circles of vanishings layered atop one another like scars on the landscape. Same places that draw millions for their beauty also seem to draw the inexplicable. Experts disagree on whether the clusters prove anything. Some say they merely reflect where more people visit, and therefore where more people go missing. But rangers quietly push back. Because even in high-traffic areas, most rescues end predictably. The anomalous cases remain a tiny fraction, but they're so irregular, so clean of evidence, that they haunt everyone who touches them. One SAR veteran put it this way: most disappearances are messy, these are surgical. And that word surgical is what makes the theories spiral. How do you surgically remove a person from 10 feet away, without noise, without struggle, without scent? That question sits at the heart of every Missing 411 discussion. The rational answers crumble at the edges, the paranormal ones carry too much weight of myth, and so families are left suspended between worlds. Did their loved ones stumble? Were they taken by animal or man? Or did something older, stranger, reach out in the space of a few seconds and erase them? What we do know is this. These cases resist explanation. They occupy a space between data and folklore, between hard evidence and whispered legend. And for those who search, who map the grids, who call the names into the woods, the failure cuts deep. Because in most rescues they bring someone home. In these they bring back only questions. And perhaps that's why the 10-foot gap unsettles us more than stories of distant trails or storm-lost hikers. Because it suggests the wilderness doesn't need miles to take you. It needs only seconds. Only steps. Only the distance of a voice just ahead. Answered by silence. 8 months after Sarah vanished in that 10-foot gap, the ridgeline wore a different season. The greens had shifted to bronze. Snow had come and gone twice. The search teams had left their flagging tape in a few high branches like faded punctuation at the end of an unfinished sentence. And on a grey afternoon with a biting wind, a hunter cut across a no-name spur northeast of the trail and stopped where the ground folded into a shallow draw. He'd been following elk sign, head down, reading the ground the way his father had taught him. What broke his focus wasn't a skull or a shoe, it was color, the dull matte of a windbreaker where forest should have been. He took 2 more steps and saw what the windbreaker belonged to. He didn't touch anything. He backed away in measured paces, took out his phone, and called 911. From here, the story slows to the speed of procedure. Deputies first, then rangers, then a small forensic team. Their voices low, their gloves bright against the brown of the leaf litter. The hunter pointed without pointing. The officers thanked him and set the perimeter. Radios murmured up and down the draw. A drone rose in a neat vertical line until the canopy gave way to sky. On the monitor, the world flattened into topo and texture. Fir crowns like green soot. The draw a pale seam. The discovery site a pin. A second drone flew a lazy racetrack pattern, its lens catching the ridge the hikers had chosen months earlier, and the cruel geometry between that trail and this hollow. 3 ravines, 2 knife-edge spurs, and an expanse of brush so thick it braided itself. The distance from the last known point to where Sarah lay was 3.7 miles. It wasn't the mileage that turned faces tight, it was the line connecting them. She hadn't followed the trail down or up, she had cut perpendicular across grade into land that punishes that choice. The animation they would later show for the family traced that impossible path in red, snaking over contour lines that crowd together like teeth, dropping into a creek that spends spring trying to steal ankles, climbing out through windfall and salmonberry thickets, then angling into this draw, this dip in the ground, where a human body could become part of the map, if no one knew to look. Confirmation came quietly, because that's how it's done. Dental records matched. There were personal effects that needed no science. The phone with a cracked corner, the camera she wore clipped at the shoulder, the small enamel charm her grandmother had given her before her first solo hike, tucked into an inner pocket, where only family would know to feel for it. The coroner's report, careful and spare, would later write the word exposure next to cause of death, and note a post-mortem interval measured in months. Those sentences are clean and merciless in a way real life isn't. The place where she was found looks unremarkable on the ground. The draw's walls rise at angles your calves complain about, and the floor is stitched with deadfall that insists you choose your steps rather than take them. There's a point where a granite seam shows through, slick with water in spring and jewel dry in fall. If you stand where the hunter stood and look back toward the trail system, you don't see it. The forest folds and refuses to offer a straight line. Even with GPS, even with a breadcrumb trail on a screen, a body down here could go unseen by 40 people walking 20 yards apart. 20 yards is nothing in a grocery store. In a thicket of rhododendron, it's the distance between 2 worlds. When the investigators laid their maps over the drone footage, something else rose like a bruise. Day 2 of the search, when the grid was still small, when optimism still made voices lighter, volunteers had swept the west rim of this draw. A ranger had marked a corner with blue tape and written a date in Sharpie that the drone could still read months later. The nearest transect line, an imaginary path between two survey flags, fell within a quarter-mile of where Sarah was found. A quarter-mile is close on a road. Under a canopy, with the ground eating sound and the brush punishing straight lines, it's an expanse. But still, the grid had come near enough that a shout might have carried, near enough that a whistle could have cut through if breath and will remained. We put that near on screen. The animation shows the searchers like blue beads sliding along ridges. It shows dogs and their handlers in yellow, zigzagging to turn human scent into a shape. It shows the helicopter's thermal camera, tracing wide grey arcs over the treetops. And then it shows a single red dot, the last known point where Marcus heard Sarah answer, and a second red dot in the draw. The gap between them glows like a nerve. If you've never seen a scent dog work, it looks like language. They take an item, a shirt, a hat, a camera strap, and breathe it in like a verb they like the taste of. Then they pull, whole bodies alive to the grammar of air. On the day Sarah vanished, those dogs worked to the bend in the trail, and then gave a performance that handlers have trouble describing without frustration. The lead dog circled the same patch of ground and sat. The backup dog, given the same scent, pulled hard for 10 yards, dropped her head, traced an invisible line back to the bend and lay down. They don't quit, one handler told us. They tell you when the sentence ends. The sentence ended at the bend. 8 months later, the story picked up 3 ridges over without punctuation in between. Forensics gave us a timeline with the honesty of approximations. Based on tissue condition, and the relentless calculus of insects and weather, the coroner estimated that Sarah survived somewhere between 24 and 48 hours after she disappeared. The word hypothermia appears in that report because out here it so often deserves to. Nights, even in summer, drop farther than city bodies remember. Wind strips heat from wet skin faster than any math a brain can do when it's scared. Hypothermia is not just cold. It's a set of decisions that stop making sense. People undress when they should layer. They crawl into brush to feel held. They grow quiet instead of calling. It is both medical and mythic in the way it seduces. And yet, what the report didn't explain was the silence. If Sarah survived 1 night, maybe 2, she would have heard the helicopters. Even under canopy, the thump of rotors pours down the seams of terrain. She would have heard whistles and names shouted by people who know to breathe between syllables so the second call carries farther. She carried a whistle herself. It was on the same cord as the small light she used to find zippers in the dark. The whistle was found. It showed no sign of being used. Her phone, bafflingly, offered no new breadcrumbs. The last photo remained that trail-side selfie 3 minutes before she vanished. No low battery pings. No pocket dials to towers. Dead zones do that, yes. But phones sometimes collect data even when they can't send it. Hers collected nothing after the bend. Then there's the clothing. SAR veterans learn to read what people do with their layers when they get in trouble. The paradoxical undressing that can come with severe hypothermia. The betrayal of the body telling the brain you're burning when you're freezing is a terrible, familiar sign. Sarah's clothing told a different story. Her jacket was zipped. Her base layer was where it belonged. Her pants were intact at the knees. No tears from crawling through the kind of brush that will happily keep a thread as a trophy. Her boots were on and laced. The kind of laces you only get to ride up once and then never again unless your hands were steady. If she bushwhacked 3.7 miles across those ravines, the fabric should have borne witness. It didn't. There were scuffs. There was the slow wear of time and weather. There wasn't the narrative of flight written in nylon and seams. We show that evidence with care. The camera passes respectfully over a duplicate kit laid on a studio table. Jacket, base layer, pants, boots, and the narrator's voice stays low. The goal isn't shock, it's clarity. This is what would usually shred if you battled brush for miles. This is what didn't. The audience understands without us needing to make the image harder than it has to be. One ranger walked us through another inconsistency. He pointed at the ravines on the map as if they were dogs he'd known by name. If you drop into these, you follow water, he said. Humans do. Animals do. Water is a handrail. She didn't follow it. She crossed it at an angle and kept that angle. He tapped the screen with a finger that had cut itself on more than one talus slope. That's not what lost does, that's what intent does. Intent requires a destination. Nothing in the draw suggested one. So what happened between the bend and this hollow? The accident narrative is the first to present itself because it's the one that keeps most of us sane enough to keep hiking. A step off the tread, a roll down a slope hidden by salal, a blow to the head that turned the world sideways and the path into a rumor. From there, everything gets simple. Downhill, water, cold, sleep. The problem is that simple turns messy under examination. There were no obvious cranial injuries. The terrain between the trail and the draw forces choices. It doesn't usher you. Even dazed, most people stop when a ravine tells them no and turn to follow its edge. The red line across our map refuses those instincts at every fold. The abduction narrative makes an appearance because we live in a world where a bad person can ruin a family. But out here on a Saturday, with other hikers passing in both directions, with no tire tracks on the access road, and no reports of a stranger shadowing anyone, it feels like borrowing the wrong toolbox. And even if you force it to fit, someone pulled her off the trail in seconds and carried her into brush. The forensic picture in the draw doesn't cooperate. There's no evidence of another set of footsteps engraved in the ground the way a hurried exit writes itself. No rope fibers. No tape residue. Dogs that couldn't follow a scent 10 feet from where she spoke would have pinwheeled at the smell of a second person engaged in violent work. They didn't. They told the handlers, in the only grammar available to them, that the sentence ended where Marcus stopped, and listened to an answer that never became a body. Animals? In the North Cascades, cougars are real, and black bears are a rumor most days that can become a fact on the wrong day. Predators don't make clean mysteries. They drag, they mark, they return. The coroner saw none of that. Whatever wildlife interacted with Sarah's remains did so after the park had had months to do what parks do. Fold everything under leaf, and weather, and patience. We put the expert voices in here, not as authority to close the file, but as texture that keeps the speculation honest. A SAR coordinator who has mapped more grids than most of us, have walked miles. We did what we always do. We started at the last known point, we worked out in rings, we prioritized drainages. The grids passed near where she was found. Could we have missed her? Yes. The canopy is a liar. Could she have been there the whole time? Maybe. But if she lived through the first night, she would have heard us. People answer when they hear hope. A forensic anthropologist. Hypothermia is the least wrong explanation when exposure is likely and injury is minimal. It's also a placeholder when you lack a mechanism. It tells you what, not why. A dog handler who asked us not to use her name. When a dog lies down like that at a last scent point, I've learned to accept that something happened right there that we don't know how to track. We return to the trail bend because stories like this always do. The reconstruction puts the camera at Marcus's shoulder. The sound design steps back and lets the forest speak. Wind walking through firs, the small chitter of something with a tail, boot tread tamping duff into small agreements with gravity. His voice is calm the first time he calls. The second call carries urgency but not panic. The third finds a tremor that only he hears. David rounds the bend, his breath a little brighter in the microphone, and asks the question he has heard in his own head since that day. Where's Sarah? It's a line reading no actor would want because it doesn't have room for drama. It's all receiver. The forest holds the words, considers them, and gives back nothing. When we talked with the two of them months after the discovery, their sentences braided and unbraided the way people do when they've told a story separately 100 times and are learning to tell it together. Marcus has learned to speak softly about the loudest moment in his life. If she survived a night, he said, she heard me. She heard us. She knows we didn't stop. He looked past the camera when he said it, as if the lens were a window, and someone might be on the other side who needed the sentence finished. I keep thinking about the whistle, David said, almost interrupting himself. She's the one who told me to wear one. She's the one who rolled her eyes when I said I felt silly. If she had breath, she would have used it. Their grief does not perform. It sits between them like a third person on a couch they wish were smaller. There's a moment we pushed into the cut, even though it isn't relevant, in the cold way police reports use that word. The trail camera they placed after the official search ended, clipped to the trunk at the bend, watching a rectangle of world that becomes proof that a thing is still there when it's not seen, caught nothing. Deer. Once. A barred owl owning the night. Twice a bear. A black shape that snouted the lens and breathed fog over it. And then week after week of forest doing what forests do with no human in the frame. The camera does not testify to mysteries. It writes a gospel of normal that only makes the abnormal feel sharper. We allow ourselves a minute to sit with the math of sound and distance. A human yell in dense woods travels about 100 to 200 yards before the trees make a buffet out of its edges. A whistle cuts farther, up to half a mile if the wind keeps its hands off it. Helicopters announce themselves to ridgelines and draws at distances measured in miles. If Sarah was in that draw the first 2 days, she lived inside the envelope of all those sounds. Did she not have the whistle? It was there when they found her. Did hypothermia steal the logic required to use it? It does that. Did she blow it and the sound get eaten by a fold of terrain and an unlucky wind? It happens. Theories that hold water individually start to slosh when you pour them into the same container. If you're waiting for a solution, for the edit that tightens every loose tie and clicks the buckle, this is where we tell you that you live in the same world we do. We want there to be a single mechanism that turns the 10-foot gap from terror into lesson. The closest we get is a collection of small truths that, stacked, look like an answer until you push on them. The canopy blocks FLIR more than people think. Dogs are powerful tools that still fail when a scent column breaks, or air tumbles off a ridge in a way we can't see. Human bodies, even fit ones, make poor choices when the light goes and a scrape on the shin starts to whisper about infection and exhaustion. Clothes can stay intact across miles of brush if a person finds game trails that braid through the worst of it, or if an animal path smooths the way. Hypothermia kills without announcing itself. And when it does, it steals voices before it steals hearts. Against that realism, the shape of the case still feels wrong. The straight line cuts across terrain that argues. The silence where a whistle should exist. The dogs that circle their question mark and sit. The garment seams that don't write the story the map insists on. The time window, that narrow, stupid space in which a life can step from one side of a switchback to another, and find an outcome that no one knows how to retell without using the word vanish. We don't resolve that dissonance, we let it hum. Marcus says he doesn't hike that trail anymore. David jokes, because jokes keep breath moving, that the forest owes them one. What they both mean is that the ritual of being outside has changed its rules. They walk closer, they speak more, they narrate their motions. Stopping, one says 15 feet back. Stepping off, the other adds, and both wait until line of sight returns like permission. They carry 2 whistles each, not because one fails often, but because the redundancy feels like a spell that might matter in a place where spells and statistics seem to take turns being in charge. We leave the drawer with the camera looking up, the drone climbing until what was a tangle becomes pattern. The ravines resolve into fingers, the ridges look like ribs. The path the red line took looks less like a defiance of geography, and more like a dare the land sets for anything that tries to move across it without asking first. The narrator's voice returns to the bend. Because everything does. 10 feet of curve. 15 seconds of time. The difference between hearing someone answer and never hearing them again. The end of the sentence, the beginning of the gap. You could choose to be angry at that gap. Many people are. You can choose to fill it with certainty. Many do. We could tell you it was a faulty dog. A false assumption about distance. A trick of wind on the whistle. A bravery that carried someone into a line across the map that a different day might have refused. All of that is plausible. None of it feels satisfying. The honest ending is the one that respects what remains unknown, and still makes room for what we can learn. On screen, while the map fades back to texture and the ridge becomes just that again, we offer the quiet instructions that don't solve mysteries but do keep people from becoming them. Don't give the woods 10 feet if you can help it. Close the space. Speak what you're doing out loud. When someone disappears, mark where, mark it again, and call sooner than your pride tells you to. Don't rely on a phone to make breadcrumbs. Make them yourself. Use flagging, cairns that are obvious, notes in a pocket that say which way you turned. Teach your body to wear its whistle where your mouth can find it in the dark without your eyes having to ask. At the end of our time with Marcus and David, we asked them what they wanted the story to carry for other people. Marcus looked down at his hands like he'd lost something there, and found only knuckles and old scars. That she was real, he said. Not a case, not a theory. A person you could talk to about boots and noodles, and how to hang a bear bag with one throw. David nodded. And that close isn't negative space, he said, making a rectangle with his hands the way people do when they're trying to frame what hurts. It's not empty, it's the most important thing, keep it. We close not with answers but with a return to the line that has threaded through every act. The 10-foot gap is not mythical, it's measurable. It's the length of a small car, or a pair of boots, set heel to toe 30 times. It fits in your living room, it fits inside a breath. It's also the place where, for reasons we don't understand, the landscape sometimes takes more than we can easily give back. That inhabitant of the bend, the silence that waits where an answer should be, will live with the people who loved Sarah for the rest of their lives. It will live here too, in the story, where we keep it exactly the size that it is, and refuse to make it bigger with fear or smaller with false certainty. What happened to Sarah? The report says exposure. The map says perpendicular. The clothes say intact. The dogs say the sentence ended. The helicopter says there was nothing hot under the leaves when it looked. The phone says selfie, 3 minutes before. Marcus says I heard her voice. David says I rounded the bend and she wasn't there. The forest says nothing you can write down. We are left with that, and with the simple, hard things that still matter. Hold the people you're with inside arm's length. Share your plan. Slow your steps when the trail curves. And when the woods grow quiet in the way that makes the small hairs on your arms stand up, answer out loud with your own sound. Sometimes the only thing that pushes back at the gap is our insistence on occupying it together. The woods always deserve the last word, but before we leave you in silence, there are a few truths worth carrying. These aren't theories or speculation. They're the kind of ground-level advice that SAR teams, rangers, and seasoned backcountry travelers repeat until it becomes muscle memory. Because if there's anything these stories show, it's how fragile the margin can be between a safe return and a family waiting for answers that never come. Stay within line of sight. That's the simplest, hardest rule. Don't give the trail 10 feet if you don't have to. In forests, ridgelines, or switchbacks, even seconds of separation can turn into the kind of gap no one knows how to close. Hike like you're tethered, call out when you stop, answer when someone calls, and keep the space between you and your partner small enough that a bend can't swallow it. If someone does vanish, mark the disappearance point immediately, drop a jacket, scratch a line in the dirt, pin it on a GPS. That one action gives searchers a place to start. And in cases like Sarah's, that can mean the difference between hours of guessing and minutes of clarity. The forest erases fast. Your marker is the anchor. Always carry the tools that make noise and light. A whistle isn't a novelty. It cuts through distance far better than a human voice. A headlamp, even in daylight, can be the signal someone catches at the corner of their vision. A GPS unit or, better, a personal locator beacon can take the wild's most unnerving quality, its indifference, and bend it in your favor. Technology isn't perfect under heavy canopy, but it's better than silence. Know your limits, but also respect the limits of the landscape. Terrain changes the rules. Ridges fold sound, hollows trick your sense of direction. Water pulls you downhill whether or not that's the safe way out. Accept that the forest has its own logic, and your best defense is humility. Pause, think, and don't assume a straight line will stay straight once you're inside the trees. Remember this, even the professionals, the rangers, who know every bend of a trail, admit there are moments that leave them shaken. They don't speak in absolutes, they tell stories, they warn, they remind each other that training doesn't make you untouchable, it just makes you prepared. Marcus carries his own reminder. He told us, quietly, that he'll never forget the last moment he heard Sarah's voice. "I heard her answer," he said. "She was right there. And then, she wasn't. I'll never understand what happened in those 10 feet. That sentence is the one we leave you with. The gap isn't measured in miles or hours. It's measured in a bend of trail, in half a dozen boot steps, in the heartbeat between calling a name and waiting for a reply. In the world of missing 411, 10 feet can be the distance between safety and never coming home. And that's why, the next time you shoulder a pack and step into the trees, remember that the smallest decisions, staying close, carrying the right gear, marking the ground where you stand, are the ones that matter most. The woods don't always give second chances, so keep your people in sight, keep your whistle close. And never assume the silence is empty. Sometimes, it's the loudest thing you'll ever hear.